Hello, and welcome back. In the last video, I shared some thoughts on the psychological and ontological approach to the occult. It is now time to look into how reading Bergson has affected my view on the occult, shifting my thought to a more ontological approach. So how might one see Bergson's project at large? Very early on, in his first major work, Time and Free Will, he asked something along the lines of, could we attribute much of our philosophical blockages and stagnation to our innate tendency to reduce time to space? Has time been missing from the philosophical tradition? It is this starting point that will fuel him to develop a philosophy of time that is not reducible to space. He will refer to this non-spatialized real time as duration to distinguish it from the spatialized image of time that we naturally resort to. In pursuit of this project, it will become apparent why duration has been missing from our thought. This is simply due to the fact that to grasp a concept is to solidify it and translate it into static compartmentalizations. In the preface to Time and Free Will, Bergson summarizes this issue very succinctly by stating, language requires us to establish between our ideas the same sharp and precise distinctions, the same discontinuity as between material objects. On a deeper level, he will argue that our language and concepts have largely developed in service to our survival, of which our negotiation of material objects is most fundamental, in turn shaping our logic to be a logic of solids. So, if it is impossible to grasp time without transforming it into space and thus eradicating its essence, how can one go about developing a philosophy around it? And how can one even know it to exist in the first place? This project is no doubt extremely difficult, but Bergson's ability to navigate the difficulties that arise is what allows his philosophy to bring something new to thought. The idea that to grasp something is to know it is at the root of the problem. Are there other ways to know other than by reflective thought? Bergson says of course there is, for we know what it is like to eat a strawberry prior to our understanding of it, or our reflection upon it. We know it through immediate experience. This is how we know real time, or duration, through immediate living experience. The problem is that as soon as we reflect upon it, it is no longer a living, dynamic reality, but rather a static representation of it. It is like that old tale where a character mistakenly wishes that everything they touch turns to gold, yet in our case, it is that everything we conceptualize through reflective thought turns into space. So how does one navigate this issue? Bergson, of course, must write his ideas down, must conceptualize and formulate them. It is very aware that everything we touch in this matter becomes spatialized. Therefore, he sets up the conditions for our thinking. He points out the hazards, shows the places in which spatial logic has led us down obscure roads, and most importantly, he uses this awareness of our tendency to spatialize to ask or arrive at new questions that do not fall into the same old spatial trappings. This is a very nuanced approach and must be embraced with a certain delicacy and agility. It is not a point we get and then move on. It is something we must continually remind ourselves of. Everything we touch by means of reflective thought turns into space, but experience itself reveals that dynamic, living processes are non-reducible to these static representations. It is in this sense that reading Bergson for me, in itself, is a spiritual pursuit, or rather, a practice. I must constantly maintain this effort, and not just receive the static concepts on the page, but enter into dynamic thought itself. I progress, shift, and transform as I go, and these movements are induced. If I remain safely untouched as a static subject that receives concepts, I've not left the domain of spatialized thinking. The way in which we must navigate this paradoxical domain is by entering into immediate experience itself and retrieving an imprint of its quality without confusing it with its spatial representation. This approach is what Bergson refers to as intuitive thinking. This involvement with nuance and seeming paradox that intuitive thinking deals with has much in common with spiritual practice, such as koan contemplation in the Zen tradition and various types of meditation. In this sense, we can see how even in its form, Bergson's approach is tightly related to spiritual practice, and is one of the ways in which I see him as relevant to occult thought and practice. Yet I want to delve into more explicit examples of how Bergson's unique approach that produces new and invigorating ideas is of great substance to my occult interests. Now we'll take a brief overview of duration as it is presented in Time and Free Will, and then how it is expanded in Matter and Memory. In Time and Free Will, Bergson shows us that our experience cannot be translated into spatial terms without skewing what experience is actually like. Through careful observation, he understands that our experience is not composed of moments separate from each other, but rather is a continuous, ever-changing evolution of our entire being, where all shades and colors of our lives interpenetrate in the invigorating production of novelty and creativity. This arrives at the idea that our experience is the continual contraction of the past into the present, in a qualitative thickness of duration. In Bergson's next book, Matter and Memory, the goal will be to reveal the absolute reality of the past. In doing so, he will try to show that duration is not isolated to the human experience, as he suggested in Time and Free Will, but is what makes the human experience possible. This conclusion will seem to contradict the hard divide between inside and outside, or mind and matter, set out in Time and Free Will. Yet with a little effort, one can see that matter and memory is really just an expansion or a deepening of the motion set out in Time and Free Will. A deepening and widening that reconciles the simplified divisions that helped in clarifying the initial trajectory of thought. Let's take a deeper look at the concept of duration presented by Bergson. We'll start with the subjective formulation put forth in Time and Free Will as a type of stepping stone and carry these principles into the more tricky idea of an ontological duration, a duration that exists beyond personal subjectivity. In Time and Free Will, Bergson asks us to become aware of our experience as it unfolds, or in other words, the experience of time. Through a careful process of introspection, we can intuit that our understanding of time as something that is quantitatively measurable does not agree with our immediate experience of living, flowing time. This is no easy task, for we must in some way reflect on our experience without reducing it to a static, spatialized representation. And this is just what reflective thought does. How can we know that our experience is different from our recollection of it? How can we recall without reflecting? We must perform the paradoxical task of becoming aware of immediate experience and holding onto something of its quality or feeling in order to see how it differs from our representations of experience. This nuanced approach is what we described as intuitive thinking earlier in the video. Intuitive thinking involves thinking with feeling and quality, and yet it can be very rigorous. Unlike space, our experience, or duration, does not consist of separate moments with hard, impenetrable outlines like those of material objects. There are no moments in flowing time, only a continuous flux of interpenetration. Let's look at the way in which we experience music to understand this more intimately. Notes of a song, as we experience it concretely, are not discrete, separate units. They contract and interpenetrate into a non-spatial thickness or perhaps a richness of experience. This is duration itself. Even if we posit a song that is composed of staccato notes with vast gaps in between them, we still experience them as containing something of their antecedent notes. In time, they are not separate. We cannot attribute this presence of the antecedent notes to a physical sustain that mixes with the present notes as they come in the creation of chords, for there is a gap of silence in between each note. Yet the antecedent notes do affect our experience of the present notes. They are part of the experience as they sustain virtually into the present in a thickness of experience. This is just what we call melody. The reality of the past and its ability to become a part of our immediate experience in this context becomes very obvious in the case of an error. Even in the case of a song where all notes are separated by gaps of silence, if a musician hits a note out of key, we'll notice it immediately. A C sharp could sound absolutely abrasive when played accidentally in a song that is in G major, or it could sound very harmonious when played in a song that is in C sharp. This shows that notes are not really separate in the experience of music, but resonate virtually across time, interpenetrating each other in a dynamic widening of the present. Our experience, no matter how immediate we believe it to be, has a thickness of duration. For every single plucked note contains hundreds of vibrations. In the same way that the notes of a song mix virtually across time in the thickness of a melody, so do the vibrations contract into the thickness of a tone. This realization that time is not composed of moments, but rather is a continuous flux at all resolutions, is a major finding in Time and Free Will. It shows that we cannot treat experience as if it were space, and Bergson uses this finding to rethink questions of freedom. Yet in many ways, Bergson isolates this idea of pure time or duration to the interior of the human subject. After reading Time and Free Will, one might be left with a feeling that time exists only in our heads. In his next book, Matter and Memory, he will reconsider this limitation and see if there is not a broader way to conceive of duration. This development of a deeper duration is one that I find incredibly influential and relevant to the occult topics I mentioned at the beginning of this series. In the beginning of Matter and Memory, Bergson reapproaches the problem of perception and explores the possibility that the brain's sole function is to redirect movements and that it does not and cannot produce representations. I go over this in depth in my video on Bergson's perceptual image. For now, I will briefly trace the contours of this starting point, as I believe it is fundamental in its broadening of duration. In holding that the brain is not an organ of representation, Bergson suggests that the image of perception already exists in the world. In this sense, it would not be an image of anything, for the image belongs to the things themselves. The world is composed of images, and so our perception is in the world. This move opens us to the world. Our experience is no longer confined to us because, at its most fundamental level, it consists of images that are a part of the world. Even in this initial move, we can begin to see how the hard divide between inside and outside starts to bleed, as the perceptual image no longer belongs to the domain of consciousness, rather, it is a part of things themselves. Let's see how this foundational crack allows us, or even requires us, to also broaden our sense of duration beyond the interiority of the subject. Remember, Bergson formulated the hypothesis of the external image as a response or an alternative to what we refer to today as the hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem of how brain matter, or any matter, could produce a representation. His radical, but also incredibly simple move is to ask whether or not matter is exactly as it appears to the philosophically and scientifically unaware mind. That is, as an aggregate of images, already imaged right where they exist in space. If this is the case, If the brain doesn't produce perceptual representations, then memory, in the form of images, cannot be produced by the brain either. Now, the brain obviously has a deep relationship with our conscious states, and damage to the brain can affect both perception and memory. Bergson does not deny this. Rather than seeing the brain as something that produces conscious representations, he sees it as a center that redirects movements, expanding them into a number of equally possible reactions. This is exactly where conscious states and brain states become tightly related, as consciousness becomes relevant in the selection of an action, but is also confined or modulated by the possibilities that the brain states prefigure. This is obviously more complicated than presented here, but it is a knee-jerking instance for opposition that I had to address at least briefly. The point is that for Bergson, image perception and representational memory have to do with action, and thus the brain, but they in no way are produced by the brain. We might then ask, where does memory exist if not in the brain? This question, in asking where, shows our stubborn tendency to strive and understand the world in terms of space. Bergson holds that time is radically non-spatial. It exists as becoming. It is not in anything. Thus, the past is not located anywhere. But just because we can't point at it, it doesn't mean that it is not real. Bergson affirms this by stating, quote, "There is no more reason to say that the past effaces itself once it has been perceived than there is to suppose that material objects disappear when I cease to perceive them." This will lead to Bergson's bold assertion that the past exists in all of its detail and is real as space, only it exists differently. This implies a sort of global, objective memory. The past does not vanish, it exists virtually in what Bergson refers to as pure memory. This reality of the past is what makes remembering in the normal sense of the word possible. Let's look at the actual process or experience of remembering to help us understand the nature of the virtual or the past as it becomes actualized in our present. This is akin to the difference between memory itself and the remembering of or the retrieval of a memory. Try to recall something at the brink of your memory. Maybe it's your grade 1 teacher. Maybe it's the name of the last movie you watched. What is this experience like? How is it even possible that we can select something at the brink of our memory if it hasn't been recalled yet? That is, if it hasn't been identified. We do so by adopting an attitude. We withdraw ourselves from the present and perhaps look down at the ground or close our eyes in an effort to open ourselves to the past. After this initial negative effort of withdrawal occurs, it becomes apparent that a secondary effort comes into effect. The secondary effort of retrieval we cannot describe. What is happening when we blindly search in the obscurity for something we have yet to identify? This we can only know obscurely by feel. This obscurity is the nature of the virtual. As the thing being recalled begins to take shape, it becomes clearer and clearer. It becomes actualized as a memory image. This expedition into the dynamic process of the virtual becoming actual shows us two things. It shows us that prior to the actualization of a memory image, there is something there. The memory before it was recalled existed virtually, in that real but obscure state we withdrew to. It also shows us that the image retrieved is different in kind from what it was before it was retrieved. As we can sit at our desk and repeat this blind process of memory infinitely, we begin to understand that the past is there already. Prior to being recalled, it exists virtually, having its own structure, independent from what we can and do retrieve from it. If we meditate on this carefully, we might be able to conceive of how the entirety of the past exists virtually, and that the virtual is real, it is just not actual. An absolute reality of the past also allows for us to conceive of a duration that is not confined to the human subject, as the past is no longer confined to our subjective memories. In the next and final video, I will touch on how the virtual becomes very transformative in my understanding of specific occult practices, such as necromancy, and how it is useful on a more general level to escape the suffocating habits of materialist thought that constantly threaten our spirituality. Thank you for listening.